What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at the class system in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, or as it's known in-game, the Doctrines, which is a recent change. It used to be called the Occupation or Career System. And while I recently went over character creation in the beta here, I thought it would be nice to touch upon the ideas at play in terms of how these things work. That is to say, how you go about actually making a class, what some of those upgrades look like, what to expect, that kind of thing, in a bit more depth, as the character creation video was relatively light on details on that particular front. That said, before we fully dive into this, I do want to mention that it's important to remember this is a beta, which means, of course, that things are not final. And in some cases, we actually don't have all of the options that we will wind up with. That said, let's actually dive into this. And the first and most important thing to understand is that right now, your class or your playstyle, if you will, is actually dictated by two different things: your origin as well as your doctrine choice. Your origin choice is the one we will be picking first, and it's more of a representation of what we were in life before becoming a rogue trader. And as we see on screen here, this can include things like being a psyker or a commander, a noble, a priest, etc. And while some of these are not finished, the important things to understand here is that picking your origin is going to give you attribute and skill modifiers, both right at the beginning and when you level up at certain points. In the future, when our character levels up, we'll be able to pick attribute and skill upgrades as we go, and based on the origin you pick, you can actually add to the list that is available to you by picking the appropriate origin. So as we can see here, the Astra Militarum commander will actually add perception as an attribute and Medicae as a skill when they level up at the appropriate times. Now, the other big things we get here are an ability as well as talents that supplement that ability. Some of the unfinished origins don't actually have this choice yet. They don't let you have an ability or have talents to grant with that ability implemented right now, but this is the general gist of it. And those are all things you want to take into account when you are picking your character's origin. So if we want to make a character that is using guns in some way, we want something that augments our ballistic and perception modifiers, as well as maybe has an ability that supplements that. And to give a more specific example of this, let's look at Sanctioned Psyker Biomancer. While it might not be readily apparent because the game doesn't actually show you this, as it is included in the Biomancy Psyker abilities, they actually make great characters for melee, and this is because one of their abilities that they get right out of the gate is called Iron Arm, which beefs up a character's physical ability on top of a plus to their base toughness, makes them well suited to becoming a melee fighter if you want, on top of their natural psyker abilities. Or we could take a look at the Commissar, who gets an ability called Let's Give Them Hell, which lets them mark an enemy with an attack, and the ally who kills that enemy can get an additional turn, or they could target an ally and grant them more action points and move points on their turn, which makes them well suited for the leader class that we'll talk about here momentarily. So as you can see, the important thing to understand about origin is that it is the baseline of your class. And while it doesn't strictly speaking have to line up with what you choose as your doctrine or class, it can help you out quite a bit if you do so. Now, that brings us to the doctrines themselves. Again, we are in the beta, this is not finished, and there should be more of these at release, but right now we've got 4 base doctrines as well as 3 advanced doctrines. Right at the beginning of the game, we can pick either a fighter, leader, adept, or marksman. We will level up this class all the way to level 15 before getting to spec into an advanced doctrine. And while that might sound like a lot, that's actually just the first act of the game, which is like maybe 5 to 10 hours, depending on how fast you're playing. Broadly speaking, these are relatively straightforward, at least in terms of what we have right now. Though, it is worth mentioning that whatever base class you choose can only spec into certain advanced doctrines later. And while we're dealing with relatively limited options at the moment, I imagine that will be more of a thing to note in the full release of the game. But as for right now, we've got Fighter, which is obviously our melee character. We're going to get things like the ability to charge, as well as the ultimate ability called Daring Breach, which lets them make multiple melee attacks when our sort of group ultimate meter fills up, known as momentum, or potentially falls very low. Based on how you're doing in combat, one of those extremes will grant you access to a big ability, known either as Desperate Measures or the Heroic Moment, respectively. The fighter version of that is the ability to attack in melee multiple times, and that can even be upgraded to potentially allow you to move if you kill something, restoring your movement points on doing so. So when it comes to melee combat, they are very strong. The downside, of course, being that they have to get to the target, and in a cover-based, turn-based system, that can be a little bit of an issue. Then we have the leader. While the game actually tells you right now in beta that the leader is undercooked, that's not exactly true. Leader is incredibly strong, and this is simply because they have the ability to grant other people extra turns. They can also buff and provide support to other characters as well. So on a regular turn for them, they could conceivably give another character a turn as well, on top of taking their own turn. And while you'll be dealing with limited resources in terms of movement and action points this way, that is not the case for their heroic ability, which just flat out gives another character a full extra turn, which makes the leader incredibly valuable on the battlefield. But then we have the adept. The adept is great at exploiting weaknesses and opening up opportunities to attack higher defended enemies, such as bosses, for instance. And while they're probably the weakest doctrine overall right now, having one with you to sort of dismantle the defenses on a tough enemy is still very useful, with their ultimate ability basically being about just that, stripping the defenses off a large target. Lastly, though, we have Marksman. This is our ranged doctrine, which is naturally all about shooting weapons. We get an ability called Shot on the Run, which allows us to take our turn normally, use that ability, and then move some more, as well as take another shot. Their heroic moment, or ultimate ability, is called Military Excellence. This is going to let them shoot multiple times based on the gun they're using's rate of fire, which basically means they get to make a ton of attacks, which can make them very great at clearing out a large amount of smaller enemies. And this particular doctrine will actually change quite a bit based on what kind of weaponry specifically you're using, as there's a lot of different types of ranged weaponry, so exactly how this plays will be kind of dependent on that, but the general gist is ranged weapons. Then we have the Assassin, pretty straightforward, all about killing targets and doing as much damage as possible. This is our first advanced doctrine available at level 15. Then we have the Vanguard, which is our tank doctrine. Whoever we want to be taking the hits will be picking this one up. And lastly, we have Hunter, a doctrine that I would say is mostly ranged based that specializes in focusing down one big enemy, which usually involves marking that target to reduce their defenses. Now, most of that is pretty straightforward, but what I want to talk a little bit more specifically about is what leveling these up actually looks like, which brings us to this sort of almost clockwork looking menu that can be a lot to take in if you don't understand it, but once you figure out what these icons mean, it's pretty easy from there. Now, the first thing to know is that every sort of column as we move clockwise around this thing represents a level. So each of one of those little stacks of icons is explaining to us what we will receive at that level in terms of benefits for that doctrine. So first up, we have the hand with the finger pointing out. This represents that we will be able to choose an ability specific to our doctrine. The game will make some suggestions here, but you're pretty well free to choose. But that means you get to pick an ability at that level. And then we have potentially the most common one, which are these arrows. And this represents a skill upgrade. Skill upgrades will always come in 10s, as this game uses a D100 system, but that represents our opportunity to increase our skills. Next up, we have the unlocking padlock icon, and this represents a keystone ability, something that is passive to the doctrine we've chosen, such as the fighter's ability to gain movement points by 4, which is basically just so they can reach the target they are trying to get to in melee. Next up, we have that explosion-looking icon. This represents a talent, and while we won't go over the massive number of talents available to us here, it's important to note that these are broken down into more general stuff, as well as things like proficiencies or things relating to our origin from earlier, for instance. This is one of those things as we get closer to the actual release of the game and we start looking at proper builds, we'll discuss more in depth, but that represents talents. Then we have the scroll icon. This represents an attribute upgrade, which is done in multiples of 5. Again, you'll get a recommendation based on the doctrine you're using, and these upgrades are pretty big as they will allow us to increase our proficiency at a given thing, as well as the derivative stats for each of these attributes, such as our various skills. And then lastly, we have this gear-looking icon. This represents an upgrade to our ultimate ability or our momentum abilities. So in the case of the fighter, our Daring Breach can be upgraded with one of 4 abilities. That will make it that much more effective and devastating when we build up our momentum or lose enough of it to activate said ability in combat. You'll actually get to upgrade this twice, which can make some of these abilities particularly devastating. And that, finally, just about wraps up what you can expect from how making a class and how it all fits together sort of works here in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. But the last thing I want to leave you guys with is the stats and skills. Now, I've went over this in a video previously, but Rogue Trader uses a D100 system, which in the case of a PC game is going to be much simpler than their previous work of Pathfinder. Basically, the majority of what you need to know here is that the higher you can get the things that are important to you, the better. And that's very easy to do, as our level ups and things like that, as I've just shown you, will regularly provide you upgrades to these both attributes and skills. And that's on top of any items we happen to pick up that do the same thing. So it's relatively easy to get these pretty high. So whereas a game like Pathfinder, there's tons and tons of rules to know, this system is a little more basic, where really all you need to know is the stats that are important to you and keep upgrading those in particular. So to give an example of this, weapon skill will both increase our ability in melee, which means we won't miss very often. It will also, by default, increase our derivative stats of something like athletics. To go a little bit further, ballistic skill is your skill with ranged weapons. Willpower is your ability with a psyker or a leader. Fellowship is that character's ability to lead, which again makes them great for a leader, as well as gives you the skill check options for persuasion or coercion in conversation, etc., etc. So honestly, just a very basic system. And luckily, as we will ultimately have a party of 6 with us at any given time, it's pretty easy to spread these skills out among those 6 people to be basically very capable at most things. So really all any individual character needs to do is stick to the thing they are good at and focus on that. And given how easy that is to do in this game, I think a lot of combat is going to come down to the nuances of knowing which talents to take when, alongside understanding the best strategies to implement in a turn-based game like this, where managing the action economy is the name of the game. But that is pretty much all I've got for you guys on how Doctrines and Origins and things like that will work in Rogue Trader here. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it informative, and personally, while I enjoy a system that has a little more depth and complexity to it, I do at the same time think that this is a very clean and simple system that is going to be easy for people to learn, while at the same time still managing to retain a good amount of role-playing potential in a CRPG. Even if it does mean people like myself will have a few less videos to make on how everything actually works. But that is going to do it for this one. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.